The rising sun cast long shadows across the deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood motionless, his weathered face betraying no emotion. It was December 7th, 1941, a date that would soon be seared into the consciousness of two nations locked in a fatal embrace. 6 carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy's First Air Fleet sliced through the North Pacific waters, maintaining radio silence as they approached their target, the unsuspecting American naval base at Pearl Harbor. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," Yamamoto reportedly confided to his diary that morning, though he would not record these prophetic words until much later. The admiral, who had studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington, understood America's industrial might better than most of his colleagues. Yet here he was, orchestrating what he hoped would be a decisive blow, one that would cripple American naval power long enough for Japan to secure its greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The roots of this audacious attack stretched back decades. Japan, resource-poor and increasingly militaristic, had been expanding its empire throughout Asia since the late 1920s. The United States, alarmed by Japanese aggression in China and Indochina, had responded with increasingly severe economic sanctions. By the summer of 1941, an American oil embargo threatened to strangle Japan's military within 2 years. As noted in a retrospective analysis from the Washington Post, the collision course between Japan and America had been set long before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. America's economic stranglehold left Japan's leadership with what they perceived as only 2 choices: back down or strike first. In Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito had reluctantly approved the plan presented by his military leaders. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo assured him that a knockout blow against the American Pacific Fleet would force the Americans to negotiate rather than wage a protracted war. The meticulous planning for Operation Hawaii had begun months earlier, under the direction of Commander Minoru Genda and Admiral Takajiro Onishi, who had crafted a bold strategy: a surprise air attack using torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. At T-White, Pearl Harbor itself, American commanders Admiral Husband E. Kimmel and Lieutenant General Walter Short remained confident in the base's security. Despite warnings from Washington about potential Japanese hostilities, a Sunday morning in paradise seemed an unlikely setting for an attack. American intelligence had intercepted and decoded Japanese diplomatic messages indicating war was imminent, but crucial connecting dots remained scattered. Aboard the Japanese carriers, pilots received their final briefings. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who would lead the air assault, studied the charts of Oahu one last time. The element of surprise would be critical. The Americans had arranged their battleships in neat rows, perfect targets for the coming storm of steel and fire. The air crews, many wearing ceremonial hachimaki headbands bearing the rising sun and inspiring phrases, prepared for what many believed would be their final mission. As dawn broke across the vast Pacific expanse, Yamamoto gave his final orders. The First Air Fleet, nicknamed Kido Butai, had maintained perfect secrecy during its 4,000-mile journey from Hitakapu Bay. Now, just 200 miles north of Oahu, flight decks bustled with activity as mechanics made final checks on the 183 aircraft that would comprise the first wave of the attack. At 6 a.m., the order came. 2-2-2, charge. Fuchida watched with grim satisfaction as the first Zero fighters roared down the deck of the Akagi and climbed into the clear morning sky. Behind them came the torpedo bombers, level bombers, and dive bombers, the spearhead of Japan's most daring military gambit. As his own bomber lifted off, Fuchida could not know that he was piloting not just an aircraft, but the opening chapter of a new and terrible page in world history. The skies above Oahu remained serene as the first rays of sunlight glistened off the calm harbor waters. It was 7:48 a.m. when Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, surveying the pristine naval base below, transmitted the fateful code phrase, "Tora, Tora, Tora," signaling complete surprise had been achieved. Below him sprawled the unsuspecting heart of American naval power in the Pacific. 8 massive battleships, numerous cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels arranged with geometric precision along what the Japanese attackers had nicknamed Battleship Row. Aboard the USS Arizona, Seaman First Class Donald Stratton had just finished breakfast. The 22-year-old from Nebraska was looking forward to liberty later that day, perhaps a trip to Waikiki Beach. On the USS Nevada, the band had assembled on deck for morning colors, preparing to play The Star-Spangled Banner. These mundane, Sunday routines were shattered as the first Japanese Zeros screamed out of the sky, their machine guns strafing the peaceful harbor. It was as if someone had kicked over a gigantic anthill, recalled Ray Emery, a sailor on the USS Honolulu. There was confusion everywhere, but also an immediate rush to battle stations. Many of us couldn't believe what we were seeing. Those red circles on the aircraft wings told us everything we needed to know. According to historical records from the National Archives, the first wave consisted of 183 aircraft, including 49 high-level bombers targeting battleships, 51 dive bombers targeting other vessels, 40 torpedo bombers aimed at the battleships and carriers, and 43 fighters for air control. The precision of the Japanese attack was the result of months of intelligence work and meticulous planning. The torpedo bombers struck first, skimming just 50 feet above the harbor before releasing their specially modified torpedoes, adapted to run in the shallow 45-foot harbor. The USS Oklahoma took multiple torpedo hits along its port side. Within 12 minutes, the massive battleship began to roll over, trapping hundreds of sailors inside her hull. The USS West Virginia was hit by 7 torpedoes, but counter-flooding measures kept her from capsizing, though she settled to the harbor bottom upright. The USS Arizona's fate was sealed at approximately 8:10 a.m. A modified 16-inch naval shell converted to a bomb penetrated her forward deck and ignited the forward ammunition magazine. The catastrophic explosion literally lifted the 33,000-ton battleship out of the water. The fireball rose more than 500 feet into the air, and the concussion was felt throughout the harbor. In that single devastating moment, 1,177 men perished aboard the Arizona, nearly half the total American fatalities of the entire attack. As reported by the Honolulu Advertiser in their 50th anniversary retrospective, the explosion of the Arizona was the single most destructive act of the entire Pacific War in terms of instantaneous loss of life. The ship became both tomb and memorial for most of her crew. On Ford Island, in the harbor's center, civilians and military personnel alike watched in horror as Japanese dive bombers screamed down at hangars and parked aircraft. At nearby Hickam Field, Bellows Field, Wheeler Field, and Iwo Marine Corps Air Station, American planes, conveniently parked wingtip to wingtip as a precaution against sabotage rather than air attack, made perfect targets. Within minutes, the majority of U.S. military aircraft on Oahu were destroyed or severely damaged. Commander Fuchida circled above, directing the attack and observing the growing inferno below. The operation was proceeding even better than expected. Columns of thick black smoke now obscured parts of the harbor, but the Japanese pilots pressed their attacks with unwavering determination. The Americans, though caught completely by surprise, began mounting a desperate defense. Anti-aircraft fire began to intensify, and a few American fighters managed to get airborne. As the first wave of attackers began heading back to their carriers, a 15-minute lull fell over Pearl Harbor. This brief respite allowed some defenders to regroup, but many mistakenly believed the attack was over. Then, at 8:54 a.m., the second wave struck. 171 additional Japanese aircraft focusing on targets that had survived the initial assault. Amid the chaos and destruction, acts of extraordinary heroism emerged. Doris Dory Miller, a mess attendant on the USS West Virginia, a position to which African Americans were largely restricted in the segregated Navy of 1941, manned an anti-aircraft gun despite having no formal training and shot down several Japanese planes. For his valor, Miller would later receive the Navy Cross. By the time the second wave of Japanese attackers withdrew shortly after 9:30 a.m., Pearl Harbor had been transformed from a tranquil Sunday morning port into a hellscape of burning ships, sinking vessels, and oil-slicked waters. As the last Japanese aircraft disappeared over the horizon, they left behind a nation forever changed, and a sleeping giant beginning to stir. The silence that descended upon Pearl Harbor after the Japanese attack was almost as shocking as the cacophony that had preceded it. Thick, black smoke billowed from the devastated battleships, obscuring the Hawaiian sun and casting an apocalyptic pall over the harbor. In the water, sailors covered in oil struggled toward shore, while rescue teams in small boats desperately searched for survivors. The final toll would be devastating. 2,403 Americans killed, 1,178 wounded, 18 ships sunk or severely damaged, and nearly 200 aircraft destroyed. 6,000 miles away. In Washington, D.C., the news reached President Franklin Delano Roosevelt as he lunched in his study. His Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, called with the terse message, "Mr. President, it looks like the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor." Roosevelt, who had long feared such a possibility, nonetheless appeared stunned by the reality. According to his secretary Grace Tully's memoir, the president's face turned gray. He gripped the arms of his wheelchair until his knuckles turned white. As night fell on Hawaii, the enormity of the disaster became clearer. 5 of 8 battleships, the Arizona, Oklahoma, California, West Virginia, and Nevada, were either sunk or severely damaged. Miraculously, all but the Arizona and Oklahoma would eventually be raised, repaired, and returned to service. Even more fortunately for the American war effort, all 3 Pacific Fleet aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, had been at sea during the attack. The New York Times reported in its December 8th edition, "In a calculated military gamble, Japan has staked its future as a nation on a surprise offensive that achieved tactical brilliance, but may prove the greatest strategic miscalculation in modern warfare. Indeed, the attack had left untouched Pearl Harbor's vital infrastructure. Its repair facilities, oil storage tanks, and submarine base remained intact. This oversight would prove critical in the coming months as Pearl Harbor quickly resumed its function as the centerpiece of American naval operations in the Pacific." In the American homeland, the news of Pearl Harbor spread like wildfire. Families gathered around radios as regular programming was interrupted with bulletins. Details were scarce and rumors rampant. Had the Japanese landed troops on Oahu? Was San Francisco next? The uncertainty bred fear, but also something else. A steely resolve that transcended political divisions that had, until December 7th, kept America officially neutral in the global conflict. Robert Sherritt of Time magazine would later write, "Pearl Harbor united America as nothing else could have done." The isolationist versus interventionist debate that had raged for years was settled in minutes. We were no longer a nation arguing whether to fight. We were a nation mobilizing to avenge our dead. On December 8th, President Roosevelt appeared before a joint session of Congress. Leaning on the podium, his voice resonating with controlled fury, he delivered one of history's most consequential speeches. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, Wantaki. United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Roosevelt's speech lasted just 6 minutes. When he concluded by asking for a declaration of war, the response was nearly unanimous. Only Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin of Montana, who had also voted against entry into World War I, dissented. The Senate approved the declaration 92-0. America was at war. For Japanese Americans, the attack triggered a dark chapter in American history. Fear and racial prejudice combined to create a climate of suspicion. Within months, Executive Order 9066 would authorize the internment of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were American citizens, forcing them from their homes into relocation camps. In Tokyo, initial jubilation greeted news of the attack's success. Naval officers toasted each other with sake, and newspapers printed special editions, with banner headlines. Emperor Hirohito received the reports with his customary reserve, though he expressed satisfaction that the operation had succeeded with minimal Japanese casualties. The Imperial Navy had lost just 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines, with 64 servicemen killed. Admiral Yamamoto, however, remained troubled. When congratulated on the attack's success, he reportedly responded, I fear we have only succeeded in rousing a sleeping giant." Whether apocryphal or not, these words would prove prophetic. The admiral understood what many of his countrymen did not, that Japan had struck a nation with vastly superior industrial capacity, technological prowess, and natural resources. As December 7th faded into history, a transformed America began to awaken to its new reality. Factory workers canceled vacations, college students enlisted by the thousands, and production lines began converting to war material. The slumbering industrial giant was stirring, and its response would ultimately reshape the world order. While smoke still drifted across Pearl Harbor, the Pacific erupted in a coordinated series of Japanese attacks. Within hours of the Hawaii strike, Japanese forces bombed the Philippines, launched assaults on Guam and Wake Island, struck American bases at Midway, and began an invasion of Malaya aimed at the British stronghold of Singapore. The carefully orchestrated offensive represented the most ambitious military campaign attempted since Napoleon's conquests. For Admiral Chester Nimitz, appointed commander of the Pacific Fleet after the Pearl Harbor disaster, the strategic situation appeared grim. "We were reeling from blows we scarcely comprehended," he would later write in his memoirs. Taking command on December 31, 1941, Nimitz found a fleet devastated but not defeated. His first order created what became known as the Ghost Fleet, using painted wooden silhouettes of ships placed around Pearl Harbor to convince Japanese reconnaissance planes that the American naval presence remained substantial. President Roosevelt, meanwhile, convened urgent war planning sessions with his military chiefs. The Europe First strategy, agreed upon with British allies before Pearl Harbor, would remain in place. Nazi Germany was still deemed the greater threat. Yet something had to be done in the Pacific to boost morale and demonstrate that America could strike back. From these deliberations emerged one of the war's most audacious plans, the Doolittle Raid. As detailed in the Military Times Historical Archive, the Doolittle Raid represented America's first psychological victory, proof that the Japanese homeland was not inviolable and that America retained offensive capabilities even in its darkest hour. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 25 Mitchell bombers in a feat previously thought impossible, launching medium bombers from an aircraft carrier. On April 18, 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, these bombers struck Tokyo and other Japanese cities before continuing on to China. Though the physical damage was minimal, the psychological impact was enormous. Emperor Hirohito had assured his people that Japan was invulnerable to air attack. The Doolittle Raiders proved otherwise. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces continued their lightning advance. The Philippines fell despite General Douglas MacArthur's "Promise I shall return." Singapore, considered an impregnable fortress by the British, surrendered after just 70 days of fighting. The Dutch East Indies, rich in oil and rubber, came under Japanese control. By May 1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the Aleutian Islands to the borders of India, from Manchuria to the approaches to Australia. For ordinary Americans, the steady drumbeat of defeats was disheartening. War bond posters across the country implored citizens to remember Pearl Harbor as factories converted to 24-hour production schedules. In California, new shipyards were constructed virtually overnight. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond would eventually build Liberty ships in the astonishing time of 4 days from keel laying to launch, a process that had previously taken months. The tide began to turn in May 1942 at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval engagement in history where opposing ships never sighted each other, with all fighting done by aircraft. Though tactically a draw, strategically it prevented a Japanese invasion of Port Moresby, New Guinea, which would have threatened Australia. More importantly, it damaged 2 Japanese carriers that would be sorely missed in the coming weeks. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, now sought to finish what he had started by destroying America's remaining carriers. His plan centered on Midway Atoll, a tiny but strategic American base northwest of Hawaii. By threatening Midway, he hoped to lure the American carriers into a decisive battle against overwhelming odds. American intelligence officers, having partially broken the Japanese naval code known as JN-25, discovered the plan. Admiral Nimitz positioned his three available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway, waiting to ambush the unsuspecting Japanese fleet. On June 4, 1942, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, American dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers with their decks full of aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Within 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were transformed into infernos. A fourth carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterattack that damaged Yorktown before being sunk herself. The Battle of Midway resulted in the loss of 4 Japanese fleet carriers and over 3,000 experienced naval aviators and sailors. Japan's offensive capabilities had been crippled in what historian John Keegan called the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare. Pearl Harbor had awakened America. Midway announced its return as a Pacific power. The long road to Tokyo had begun, a journey that would lead through bloody island campaigns with names that would become legend: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The sleeping giant was now fully awake, and its terrible resolve would reshape the world. The jungles of Guadalcanal steamed under the August 1942 sun as U.S. Marines waded ashore on the first American offensive of the Pacific War. Just 8 months after Pearl Harbor, America had moved from defending its territory to taking the fight to the enemy. Operation Watchtower marked the beginning of a strategy devised by Admiral Ernest King and General Douglas MacArthur, island hopping across the Pacific, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese garrisons when possible, and gradually tightening the noose around Japan's home islands. Green troops, green jungle, and a determined enemy made Guadalcanal a fitting introduction to the Pacific War's true nature, wrote historian Richard Frank in his definitive study of the campaign. For 6 brutal months, American forces battled not only Japanese defenders, but also tropical diseases, starvation, and some of the most challenging combat conditions of the war. When the island was finally secured in February 1943, it marked the first time in the 300-year history of the Imperial Japanese Army that it had been forced to completely abandon a major battlefield. Back in America, the national transformation continued at breathtaking speed. Women entered the workforce by the millions, taking jobs previously reserved for men. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, with her bandana and flexed bicep, became a symbol of the Homefront's contribution. African Americans, while still facing segregation in the military and discrimination at home, found new opportunities in defense industries, laying the groundwork for the civil rights movements that would follow the war. The Los Angeles Times reported in a 1943 article, "America's war production has achieved what many believed impossible. In less than 2 years since Pearl Harbor, more ships, planes, and tanks are rolling off American assembly lines than all the Axis powers combined can produce." The industrial transformation was indeed staggering. In 1941, American factories had built fewer than 1,000 military aircraft. By 1944, they were producing nearly 100,000 annually. Henry Ford's massive Willow Run plant near Detroit could complete a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every 63 minutes. The nation that had struggled with double-digit unemployment during the Great Depression now faced labor shortages as it became, in President Roosevelt's words, the great arsenal of democracy. While the European theater commanded the majority of American resources in line with the Europe First strategy, the Pacific War continued its bloody progression. The battles followed a grim pattern: heavily fortified islands defended by Japanese soldiers who rarely surrendered, requiring American forces to root them out of caves, bunkers, and elaborate tunnel systems. At Tarawa, in November 1943, U.S. Marines suffered tremendous casualties securing a tiny coral atoll in just 76 hours of fighting. Nearly 1,000 Marines were killed and 2,000 wounded, shocking the American public when photos of bodies washing ashore appeared in magazines. Admiral Nimitz's terse statement, "The capture of Tarawa knocked down the front door to the Japanese defenses in the Central Pacific," offered little comfort to grieving families. By 1944, American industrial might was fully unleashed across the Pacific. New Essex-class carriers joined the fleet at the rate of 1 per month. The Fast Carrier Task Force, commanded by the aggressive Admiral Mark Mitcher, ranged across the Central Pacific, striking Japanese bases almost at will. General MacArthur fulfilled his promise to return to the Philippines in October, wading ashore at Leyte Gulf and declaring, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." The naval battle that followed, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, was the largest naval engagement in history. The desperate Japanese threw everything they had at the American invasion fleet, including the first organized kamikaze attacks. These suicide pilots, often young students with minimal training, aimed their aircraft directly at American ships. Though terrifying to sailors, these tactics reflected Japan's increasingly desperate situation. As reported by combat correspondent Ernie Pyle, the kamikaze represents something beyond military strategy. It is the manifestation of a culture that has chosen national death over surrender. It is as alien to American thinking as anything we have encountered in this war. By early 1945, American bombers operating from newly captured islands began a systematic campaign against the Japanese home islands. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the B-29 Superfortress bombers of the 20th Air Force, abandoned high-altitude precision bombing for low-level nighttime incendiary raids. The results were devastating. On March 9, 1945, a single raid on Tokyo destroyed 16 square miles of the largely wooden city, killing approximately 100,000 people. More than either of the later atomic bombings, as the noose tightened around Japan. American forces seized Iwo Jima in February and March of 1945, at the cost of nearly 7,000 American lives. The iconic photograph of 6 Marines raising the American flag atop Mount Suribachi became an enduring symbol of the Pacific War. When informed of the island's capture, Admiral Nimitz offered the immortal tribute, "Uncommon valor was a common virtue." The final major battle came at Okinawa, just 350 miles from the Japanese mainland. From April through June 1945, more than 250,000 combatants clashed in what would be called the Typhoon of Steel. When the fighting ended, more than 12,000 Americans and approximately 100,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead, along with perhaps 150,000 Okinawan civilians caught in the crossfire. As summer 1945 approached, War Department planners prepared for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan itself. Casualty estimates range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American soldiers, sailors, and Marines. Japan, despite its increasingly desperate situation, showed no signs of surrender. The sleeping giant, now fully roused, prepared to deliver its final blow. Dawn broke clear over the Marianas on August 6, 1945, as a single specially modified B-29 Superfortress named Enola Gay departed Tinian Island. At the controls sat Colonel Paul Tibbets, commanding a hand-picked crew carrying the most destructive weapon ever created by human hands, a uranium bomb codenamed Little Boy. Their target, the Japanese city of Hiroshima, a military headquarters and industrial center with a population of approximately 350,000. At 8:15 a.m. local time, the bomb bay doors opened, and Little Boy fell toward Earth. 43 seconds later, at an altitude of 1,900 feet, the world's first atomic weapon used in warfare detonated with the force of 16,000 tons of TNT. The blinding flash, followed by a mushroom cloud that rose more than 50,000 feet into the sky, instantly transformed both Hiroshima and human history. "My God, what have we done?" Robert Lewis, the Enola Gay's co-pilot, scribbled in his log as they flew away from the expanding cloud. President Harry S. Truman, who had succeeded Roosevelt following his death in April, announced the new weapon. To the world, "We have spent $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history and won." He demanded Japan's immediate surrender, warning of a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. In Tokyo, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, known as the Big Six, debated how to respond. Military hardliners still insisted on fighting to the bitter end, preparing civilians with bamboo spears for the expected American invasion. Others recognized the hopelessness of their position, but sought guarantees for the emperor's status. The debate continued even after a second atomic bomb devastated Nagasaki on August 9th, followed hours later by the Soviet Union's declaration of war and invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. The Atlantic Monthly's post-war analysis stated, Japan, in August 1945, faced not just defeat, but annihilation. The atomic bombing simply accelerated the inevitable, though at tremendous human cost. The deadlock within the Japanese leadership was finally broken by an unprecedented intervention from Emperor Hirohito himself. In the early hours of August 10th, in a quiet voice barely audible to the assembled ministers, he declared, "I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer." He ordered the government to accept the Allies' terms, with the sole condition that the imperial system be preserved. On August 15th, at noon Japan time, radios across the country crackled with the unfamiliar sound of the emperor's voice. In formal, courtly Japanese, he announced the unthinkable. Japan would endure the unendurable and surrender. Many listeners, unfamiliar with the arcane language used by the emperor, initially didn't understand that he was announcing defeat. When comprehension dawned, reactions ranged from relief to shock to ritual suicide by hardline military officers. 2 weeks later, on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese representatives signed the formal surrender documents. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, presided over the 23-minute ceremony. "It is my earnest hope, indeed the hope of all mankind," he declared, "that from this solemn occasion, a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past." The cost of the Pacific War had been staggering. Japan had lost approximately 2.7 million military personnel and civilians. China, suffering under Japanese occupation since 1937, lost an estimated 15 to 20 million people. American military deaths in the Pacific theater numbered approximately 111,000. The financial cost to the United States alone exceeded $300 billion, an astronomical sum in 1945 dollars. For the next 7 years, Japan would remain under American occupation, undergoing profound political, social, and economic reforms. General MacArthur, serving as virtual proconsul, oversaw the drafting of a new constitution that renounced war, established women's suffrage, implemented land reform, and dismantled the zaibatsu industrial conglomerates that had powered Japan's military machine. In one of history's most remarkable transformations, Japan and the United States, bitter enemies who had fought a war of extraordinary brutality, would become close allies and economic partners in the post-war era. As The Economist noted in a 21st century retrospective, perhaps the most enduring legacy of Pearl Harbor is the unlikely peace and prosperity that emerged from its ashes. For Americans, Pearl Harbor remained a powerful symbol of surprise, attack, of national unity in crisis, and of the dangers of unpreparedness. The sunken USS Arizona, with more than 1,000 sailors and Marines still entombed within her hull, became a solemn memorial visited by millions, including Japanese prime ministers seeking reconciliation. Admiral Yamamoto's reported observation about awakening a sleeping giant proved prophetic beyond even his imagination. The United States emerged from World War II not just victorious but transformed, an economic colossus and military superpower that would shape global affairs for decades to come. The isolationism that had characterized much of American foreign policy before Pearl Harbor was permanently abandoned. For Japan, the war that began with such stunning tactical success at Pearl Harbor ended in unprecedented defeat. Yet, from the ashes of atomic destruction rose a new Japan, democratic, pacifist, and eventually prosperous. The surprise attack that the imperial Japanese leadership had hoped would deliver Asian hegemony instead set in motion events that would reshape their nation in ways they could never have imagined. On the 50th anniversary of the attack, President George H.W. Bush stood at Pearl Harbor with surviving veterans and declared, "Pearl Harbor didn't merely awaken America, it awakened something within America, a unity of purpose, if not always of opinion, that transcends the self-interest that divides and a sense of obligation to an ideal larger than self." The deadly arc that began on that quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii had come full circle, From infamy to reconciliation, from surprise attack to enduring peace.